Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. As many of you know, my new book, The War on Science, is appearing July 29th of this year in the United States and Canada. And to celebrate that, we've interviewed many of the authors, of the 39 authors who have contributed to this volume. And we have 20 separate podcast interviews that will be airing over the next 20 days, starting July 22nd, before and after the book first appears, with many of the authors in the book on a host of different subjects. The authors we will have interviews with in order of appearance over the next 20 days are Richard Dawkins, Niall Ferguson, Nicholas Christakis, Maarten Boudry, Abigail Thompson, John Armstrong, Sally Satel, Solveig and Joshua Katz, Francis Widdowson, Carole Hooven, Janice Fiamengo, Geoff Horsman, Alessandro Strumia, Roger Cohen and Amy Wax, Peter Boghossian, Lauren Schwartz and Arthur Rousseau, Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin, Judith Sisa and Alice Sullivan, Carleen Gribble, and finally Dorian Abbott. The topics that will be discussed will range over the need for free speech and open inquiry in science and the need to preserve scientific integrity, stressed by our first podcast interviewee, Richard Dawkins, and will once again go over historical examples of how academia has been hijacked by ideology in the past and the negative consequences that have come from that, to issues of how specific disciplines, including mathematics, have been distorted, and how certain departments at universities now specifically claim that they are social activists, and a degree in their field is a degree in either critical social justice or social activism, not a degree in a specific area of scholarship, how ideology has permeated universities. We'll proceed also to discuss issues in medicine. Sally Satel will talk about how social justice has hijacked medicine. And also, when it comes to issues of gender-affirming care, we have a variety of authors who are going to speak about the issues there and how too often gender-affirming care claims are made that are not based on empirical evidence, in fact, falsely discuss the literature in ways that are harmful to young people. We'll talk to several people who, for one reason or another, have been canceled for saying things. Francis Widdowson at Mount Royal University in Canada, and Carole Hooven from Harvard, who eventually had to leave Harvard after saying on television that sex is binary in biology. We'll be talking to people who've looking at the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion in academia and how it's restricting free inquiry and also restricting, in many ways, scientific merit at those universities. And finally, Dorian Abbott, the last contributor to our series, will be talking about 3 principles he believes are essential to separate science and politics and keep academia free from ideology and more for open questioning and progress, and to make sure that science is based on empirical evidence, and where we go where the evidence is, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's politically correct or not, and we're willing to debate all ideas that nothing is sacred, a central feature of what science should be about and what, in some sense, this podcast is about. So I hope you really enjoy the next 20 days, and we've enjoyed bringing it to you. So with no further ado, The War on Science, the interviews. Well, Janice Fiamengo, it is always a pleasure to see you and talk to you. Thanks for being here to talk about your contribution to the War on Science book. Thanks for doing that.
Well, it's my pleasure, Lawrence.
And I like the title of your contribution, Equity Hiring by an Equity Hire. And in fact, it's kind of appropriate because it's a lovely title. But, as people who haven't done the podcast before know that we talk about people's origins, but I've had the privilege of talking to you already at a podcast and going into more detail your background. But it's kind of, therefore, nevertheless appropriate that you began your article for the new book talking about your background in a sense. You said, as a woman hired on an equity ticket in 1999, and again in 2003, twice the beneficiary. I'm well qualified to speak about the effects of equity hiring on recipients and in the academic community more generally. It's good that you're upfront about it. Why don't you talk a little bit about those experiences?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes. I'm upfront about it. Yeah. You have to be really. And even at the time, it did strike me as really quite bizarre to think that the white men that I had gone through graduate school with, were disadvantaged because of an accident of birth, and we were supposed to be very exercised and righteously indignant about injustice based on accidents of birth. But that was the case. These were young white men who had certainly never benefited from the alleged injustices of the past, and certainly even more so had not been responsible for them. And yet they were supposed to be happy about paying in their own experiences and career potential for that alleged injustice. And it struck me as shameful and horrible. And I was also interested in the effect on other people like myself in knowing that we were hired because we belonged to certain identity groups. And it seemed to me that one of the things that feminist ideology had often talked about was women's sense of imposter syndrome, that we were somehow never quite good enough. This was supposed to be, a psychology that had been produced by our experience of living in a patriarchal society. But it seemed to me far more likely that would be produced by the experience of knowing that one had been placed into a professional position, at least as much because one was a woman as because one was qualified to be there. And so I always, had that sort of guilty sense that I had got something I didn't necessarily, I hadn't necessarily achieved on merit. And what it, I think, produced in me was just a sense of the incoherence of the reigning orthodoxy at university, which was that I was supposed to stand up in my classrooms and talk about how women were oppressed and how justice needed to be done for women. And I was looking out at a bunch of young men that I knew were also going to likely have to pay in their own experiences for that alleged injustice, which didn't exist anymore. It was terrible. And I think that what it often does for recipients of equity hiring is to create that sort of bad faith where on the one hand, they are to be standard bearers for the ideology, but at the same time, they're aware that they are the recipients of preference and favor. And I think it creates a very uneasy sort of hypersensitivity to perceived slights, to doubt on the part of one's colleagues, and just a general sense that they can't simply be scholars.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance internally, but and we'll get to it as also a hypersensitivity, because if you really recognize, whether you consciously accept it, but if you even subconsciously recognize that there was that one's identity, in this case one's gender or sex, has had an impact on one's hiring, you can't help but be particularly sensitive to other people pointing it out. Did you experience any of that? My problem is it's like baseball with an asterisk when you get a certain record, the greatest number of home runs, but somehow there was an asterisk. It means you really have to wonder about that person, and if you're hired because of that, I always worry that especially females that are hired feel like they've been hired with an asterisk, and it not only creates the cognitive dissonance that you talk about for the hiree, but one can't help but but feel that let's say in physics, and I know a number of really good women scientists must feel badly because it automatically, whenever they're somewhere, they must wonder whether people are wondering that they got the position because of their sex as opposed to what they did. And it must be
Yeah,
hard.
I mean, I never had that feeling.
Yeah.
Maybe my colleagues were just way too kind to
Oh,
ever
okay.
make me feel that way. And I wouldn't have blamed them if they had, if they were looking at me with question marks. Because yeah, when you get something that you didn't necessarily deserve, then it's perfectly natural for other people to be aware of that and to think about it occasionally. I never did have that sense. I had
We're
the
good.
blissful experience of being just being able to do my work in a department where, in general, we were all just focused on doing the work. So that was
Well,
great.
it's okay. And I think part of it's due to you because it's always so charming to talk to you and interesting that I can't imagine anyone wouldn't simply enjoy having you as a colleague. I certainly would have.
Mhm.
And I do
Thank
enjoy
you.
having you as a more general colleague now. But you point out, okay, that was 1999
Yep.
and things didn't get better.
Nope.
And in fact, you say decades later, equity hiring is even more firmly entrenched in the academy with much more strict. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I would like to say also and that's what's so interesting to me in a way is that was 1999, and then again in 2003, as we said, and it had already been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah, I
what,
was.
it's continually forgotten, it seems to me, whenever we have these discussions. It's always like, oh, well, this is something, yes, it's uncomfortable right now, but it has this, overarching important purpose, and it's going to make things better for everybody in a relatively short time. And it's just for a short time. That's what we were told. It was just
Yeah,
for a
yeah.
short time. But I knew people who were told that in 1984 when they were, at the companies that they worked for. And they were told we're going to be doing a whole bunch of hiring of, X and Y. And that's just going to be the way it is for a very short time. And so for the foreseeable future, white men are just shut out of hiring, of promotions, all sorts of things, of opportunities. And it didn't end in 1984. It didn't end in 1994. It didn't end in 1999. And now here we are, it's 2025. And maybe some of it is ending because it's being forced to be ended, but it's certainly not fading away because the objective has been achieved. And so that's part of what is so interesting to me, that we have had this go on for 4 decades. At least. I mean, it started with the civil rights legislation of the 60s, but it really began in the early 80s
Mhm.
when there were concerted programs in both Canada and the United States to fulfill certain equity goals. And it was articulated that the way to do that was, to take these very concerted measures. And I don't see any end in sight. And again, the what seems to me outrageous injustice being practiced against individuals through an accident of birth, through no fault of their own, is kind of overlooked because we talk about the need for justice for others. And
Yeah.
it doesn't just stop with hiring people. It has to be manifested in academia anyway, in every aspect of the work they do, in the kind of research and scholarship that they pursue, in the students that they mentor, in the way they teach their subjects, in the graduate students that they hire to be in their labs. It permeates every aspect of their academic work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, and it's becoming, and as you know, a lot of the enforced affirmative action, or whatever you want to call it, it requires not just hiring based on some identity characteristic, but it requires people to actively support that in every aspect of their academic work.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and
I
your
mean,
your
it's
point, I mean,
amazing.
that
The
it's been
the
around for a long time is well. Sorry, could say. I didn't want to interrupt. What were you going to say?
Sorry, yeah, I'm just so excited
Yeah.
about the subject, but yeah, it's like you've probably talked about this with others too, and this isn't even really in my chapter, but the people have to sign on, they have to pledge fealty to the
Yeah.
whole ideology. So it's not enough to be a Black woman who's doing, biological science or whatever it happens to be. You have to be a standard bearer for Blackness and femaleness as it's defined by identity politics. And you have to pledge to host conferences in which that is the subject. You've got to do research where you're promoting a particular kind of approach to the subject. I mean, it's amazing that the statement, the DEI statement, has become more important than a person's demonstrated excellence and achievements at the hiring process, and it will continue to be in every stage of that person's academic career.
That's one of the problems, and we have addressed it in a few, and we will continue. But you will elaborate it very clearly. And by the way, when you're talking that, once again, elaborate. That's one of the reasons for having this volume is to try and change the culture internally, because it's only going to change internally. And if we have enough well-known people speaking out about it, at least these issues will be discussed. But what I was going to say earlier is that it's a really important point that this is not, people say, well, you have to discriminate initially or to overcome earlier discrimination, but it's just a temporary glitch. And you're right. It's not, it's certainly, it's been going on for a long time. And since the 80s, when I was a chair of a physics department in the early 90s, even then, and I bought into it. I actually hired the first 2 female faculty members in the department that I chaired. But whenever we didn't hire someone who was female, whenever the search committee did not choose a female candidate,
Yes.
I, as chair, had to write a special letter justifying why we didn't choose a female candidate. And that was started early. I became chair of a department in 1993. And so it's been going on for a while. It's not new.
Yeah.
And I like your somebody say it doesn't take a PhD to recognize that choosing applicants on the basis of sex or race and thus excluding many applicants who might well have superior qualifications will inevitably lower the intellectual standards allegedly being upheld. I mean, it's remarkable that statement, which it's hard to disagree with, is seen as not only offensive but aggressively sexist or racist. That statement itself.
Yeah, I know. It's what can you say? Every time there is one of these pushes to hire into a particular field, a whole cohort of Black scholars or First Nation scholars or female scholars, you always have people stepping forward and saying there is not going to be any lowering of the academic standard. Well, come on, let's stop lying about it. And then that was the thing that was so overwhelming to me when right after I was hired, because of course that type of hiring continued to be practiced in the departments that I was hired into, particularly the University of Saskatchewan. It was really on a let's hire women tear. And, and we never admitted, that was like, we all, without ever discussing it, I think, participated in this charade that this had nothing to do with just hiring women because they were women, even though that's what we knew we were doing. But once we had the applications in, men were invited to apply, but they might as well not have. That also really bothered me, that all these men were wasting hours of their lives and had their hopes up for positions that those on the other end were determined they weren't going to get. And we would all pretend to one another that the applicants we were choosing, who were, for the short list, for the long list first, then for the short list, and they all happened to be female, but that had nothing to do with the fact they were female. And we would lie to one another about their qualifications while putting onto the reject list pile the far superior applications of men. This at a time when there were a lot of women in English departments already. So really, it wasn't like we were hiring the first woman. We just weren't I think we wanted to get to 40%. We weren't quite there yet. But, and we would lie to one another about the fact that this particular applicant who had only published one article in a very obscure area of, female travelers in the Renaissance,
Mm-hmm.
that was equivalent to a male scholar who'd published 2 well-received monographs on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. We would lie to ourselves saying that was just as good because it was cutting-edge work and our students were going to really benefit by having this person who was totally untried and had done very little, but, was working in this really interesting area, not Shakespeare. I mean, that was just Shakespeare. Anybody can teach Shakespeare. Like the intellectual dishonesty of our excuse making was as appalling as the practice itself.
Thanks. In fact, I was going to segue to your experience at the University of Saskatchewan. You talk about the situation in Canada where we both live, and it is extreme. You give a lot of examples of lots of universities advertising specifically, putting their advertisement. And in Canada, it's allowed. In the United States, it's not allowed explicitly. It's only allowed implicitly. I mean, having been involved in many search committees, it's always done implicitly. In the United States, you can't say we're only looking for female or black or whatever candidates, but in the end, you do that, as you point out in the way you did it. But in Canada, it's explicit. You can explicitly say it. I'm always amazed when you see this ad for, we're looking for the world-class, let's say in physics, world-class experimental particle physicists, highest standards. And by the way, you can only apply if you're female or two-spirit or whatever the word is. And it's striking, that dichotomy.
I know.
Between those things. And yeah, so I'm glad you elaborated on your experience at the University of Saskatchewan, because you were on the other end at that point and you saw how that system worked.
Yeah.
And you point out that in Canada, things began in 1983 with an affirmative action policy. And a lot of this, what happened in Canada, you claim is, and you're not the only one, by the way, who's talked about this, is put on the shoulders of Judge Rosalie Abella. And I, by the way, I don't know if her husband, I used to do Canadian history. There's a well-known historian named Irving Abella. I wonder if is that her husband?
That's her husband. Yeah.
I liked his work, but anyway, but she seems to have single-handedly affected the whole climate of hiring in Canada. You want to talk about her a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, she certainly affected it in terms of the language that she used, which was very enthusiastically adopted. And she wrote the report on the commission. I can't remember the exact name now. I've got it in my chapter, but it's something like,
on equality and employment.
Yes, the report on the commission on equality and employment. So she wrote that report, and that was where she made the most explicit justification for what she called equity hiring. And in Canada, I think there was a very concerted decision made not to use the term affirmative action, which was already sort of tainted with, all of the special pleading and the overt discrimination that it involved. So Canadian intellectuals who were in favor of it came up with this idea, we'll call it equity employment instead. But she makes it very clear in her, explanation that it would be discriminating against those who did not belong to the required categories. And she said that it was
Let me interrupt you, because you quote her, and I wanted you to put your English professor hat on, because I want you to what I love is you quote her and then you parse it carefully, as an English professor might. Let's do that in real time here. So let me read the quote that you give of hers, distinguishing equality from equity. The reason in human rights that we do not treat all individuals the same way is that not all individuals have suffered historic generic exclusion because of group membership. Where assumptive barriers have impeded the fairness of competition for some individuals, they should be removed, even if this means treating some people differently. Otherwise, we can never correct disadvantage, chained as we would be to the civil libertarian pedestal of equal treatment for every individual. There's nothing to apologize for in giving the arbitrarily disadvantaged a prior claim in remedial response. And you parse that and basically say the fallacies and non sequiturs are amazing. You first talk about her reference to individuals who suffered historic generic exclusion because of group membership. You want to? I mean,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Their group suffered historic exclusion. She never does try to prove any of these things either. She simply states them. So she says that these various groups suffered historic exclusion, but by definition, no individual alive today suffered historic exclusion.
Yeah, exactly. It's a non sequitur. Yeah.
And so yes, and she does not attempt even to claim that individuals in the present are suffering group exclusion. She seems to simply imply that because there was historic exclusion, that it still lingers and
without any evidence.
But without any evidence whatsoever. And there is no evidence. I mean, all sorts of people have taken this on and have shown that it simply isn't true. So she has that. And then she says that where there are these assumptive barriers, they should be removed. Yes, everybody agrees with that. Of course, they should be removed, even if that means treating others, I forget what she says, unequally. But that there again is a complete non sequitur. If there are barriers to participation, let's remove them. Why would it be necessary to then erect new barriers against other people?
It's
shocking, the illogic, and she says there's nothing to be ashamed of. We need not apologize for what we're doing. Well, clearly she doesn't feel the need to, but what she is doing is simply practicing racial and gendered exclusions of a different sort.
Exactly. It's interesting. You're right. The taking away the barriers is great, but then there's no logical. It's not taking away barriers for some does not logically imply you must put barriers for others. But it's assumed. It's the sentence, the way she writes it is, it's obviously logically implies that.
Yeah.
And you also say implied in this assertion but never proved, and in fact unprovable, is the allegation that equity deserving groups are deserving precisely because they've experienced discrimination, have been unjustly excluded from positions they were otherwise qualified to obtain. So it basically that equity deserving groups are deserving precisely because some people may have been excluded in the past, but they now deserve something other people don't deserve. That leap, which many people make. I mean, when you hear it, it sounds, when it's said quickly, it sounds plausible, but when you start to think about it more carefully, it's not logical.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, it's completely illogical, and it's startling that this person who went on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada thinks in such a simplistic way and proclaims her, bigoted, racialist and gendered thinking, so proudly. It's quite disturbing. Yeah. And, and that became the orthodoxy that one wasn't allowed to question, and anyone who did question it was assumed to be a bigot of some sort.
Yeah, and just make it clear, you've had that you've questioned it, and you've had that experience itself as well at University of Ottawa, correct?
The experience of being called a bigot?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, but I went further. I did certainly question things and gave talks about them, and became an anti-feminist advocate. And certainly, yes, that had some crowds of people chanting obscenities at me as a result. So
now
yes.
and in fact, anyway. Let's move from you to another example you give involves Acadia University and its effort to decolonize, which is so. Why don't you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes. Well, and that is for a job advertisement for First Nations individuals, in which it's made very clear that even the most basic academic qualifications that for many decades have applied in all hiring don't apply in the case of First Nations individuals, and where we're told quite explicitly that I don't think the term folk knowledge is used, but that essentially folk knowledge, oral traditions, stories passed down through the generations are considered to be equivalent to academic training and qualifications, so that people don't have to have a PhD. It's not even clear that they need lower degrees in order to be considered for the position, because Aboriginal or Indigenous knowledge is seen as equivalent or even superior to academic knowledge. And I mean, I find it quite startling that the training, the experiences, the standards that have been upheld in academia for decades can so cavalierly be dismissed as not important. Clearly only in the case of the Indigenous, but since so much emphasis in those advertisements is placed on the experiences of students, one has to ask, don't the students deserve high quality teaching? Don't they deserve teaching and knowledge that conforms to the highest and most rigorous standards of academia? And clearly not. All that matters is that the university can say, here we have hired these Indigenous scholars.
And you make the point. I mean, it is shocking, and that basically the regular requirements are waived for certain groups, which is shocking on its own, but also never what is sort of somehow missed in this is also that action itself, one could argue, is racist in the sense of saying that Indigenous scholars need to have those requirements waived, because if they weren't waived, they wouldn't be hired. That's sort of the other side of the coin.
Yeah. Yes. And that is, yes, I mean, that is the other side of the coin, as it would be defended in the sense that, it can only be defended with the most damning condemnation of academia that you can possibly make, which is that it is racist through and through, that the knowledge and types of research that it upholds are themselves genocidal in their impact and assumptions, and that it would actually be dangerous in some way or soul destroying for Indigenous individuals to have put themselves through that process of acquiring a PhD, because it's such a racist institution. That's the sort of defense that would be made of why it doesn't matter, and why folk knowledge is essentially superior to whatever would have been acquired at the university. It's truly bizarre and embarrassing, really. And I mean, I think what it is, it flips everything on its head. And in order to avoid saying that there just aren't that many Indigenous scholars who have achieved PhDs in this field of study, instead of just admitting that and then looking at what factors have gone into making that the case and trying to rectify whatever those are, it has to say that Indigenous knowledge is by its nature superior to, not only equal to, but actually superior to non-Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, it's and once again, but when you frame things that way, once again, one cannot help but think and wonder whether individuals so hired will be ultra sensitive to any slights that may make seem to them to suggest that they achieved the position not on the basis of their scholarship, and that you become ultra sensitive to that.
Yes, I mean, you couldn't help it, I would think. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like to be brought into an institution and to be surrounded by people who have not only have PhDs and have done everything that's involved in attaining a PhD, but have competed in a very rigorous way with other PhDs to publish research and, to be involved in conferences and collaborative work. To have done none of that and to have to engage with those people, I would think it would be a quite bewildering experience for that individual. And then for everybody else around that individual, they're bending over backwards not to make that individual feel that sort of inevitable sense of being excluded in some way. And I mean, and there will have to be, a whole range of special measures taken so that that person will not have to face on a daily basis their the incompatibility of their own experiences with those of the people they're working with. And yeah, it's just bound to cause all sorts of problems. And we did have that experience at the University of Saskatchewan, actually, because we were very keen to hire someone to teach Indigenous literature who was herself Indigenous. And the person we hired, at least into a temporary position, did not have a PhD. We eventually did hire a young Indigenous scholar who had a PhD, and she was great. But we hired a writer and an activist named Maria Campbell, and she was great she was a writer. She was a very interesting woman, but she was not an English scholar who could teach literature in the traditional way. She wasn't capable of grading papers, of helping students improve their writing. Like, she hadn't been trained in any of those ways. And so we not only did a disservice to the students who were taught by her, but I think we created a very awkward kind of experience for her in being asked to do things that she hadn't in any way been trained to do. So, I just think it's bound to cause a great deal of tension and animosity and misunderstandings of all sorts.
It's a hard experience. I often say, I mean, more generally, it's always amazing me as a professor, when we hire physicists or anyone, most of them, when I was growing up, when I was hired, I had experience personally working in museums and stuff, but we hire people to do things, they've done research and they've done the research well. And now we say, great, now go into a classroom and teach. And it's really, it's a trial by fire often for everyone. And if you haven't had the experience of at least watching other people do it and very actively, then it's even harder.
Yes. But speaking of the whole question of whether PhDs are necessarily good teachers anyway, if they haven't had teacher training, of course, is another very interesting issue. But you're right. At least you've been
good
taught.
Teachers, and you've seen good teachers and bad teachers. You at least have some role models that you could. But the difficulty and awkwardness, and as a result, sensitivity, which you've alluded to before, the sort of final example of slights or feeling slights, which you give in the article, is of a very well-known example at a panel called "The Future of Classics," associated with the Society for Classical Studies, which is a Canadian group. Why don't you talk where Mary Frances Williams was castigated for uttering something about Professor Dan L. Padilla Peralta, who, by the way, is talked about in another one of the articles in our book. But why don't you talk about what happened there? Because it's kind of fascinating.
That was a fascinating incident. Anybody who just wants a little glimpse of what is going on today in academia with identity politics should really watch it. There's a short segment where you can watch Danielle Padilla Peralta's presentation, which I think is only about 10 minutes long. And then there's Q&A afterwards where there's this exchange between Mary Frances Williams, who, as I understand it, was an independent scholar. So she had no tenured position anyway. She was working in the field of classics, but she wasn't tenured at any university. And Padilla Peralta, who now, where was he at? Princeton, I think?
Princeton, yeah. He's a professor at Princeton.
Yeah. So, very Ivy League, highly esteemed.
Doesn't get much more Ivy League.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and she the word went around that she had uttered a racist slur, and she was told that she was no longer welcome at any of the meetings of the Society for Classical Studies. And it turned out that she had not said what it was rumored that she had said, which allegedly was that she had said to him that he was hired because he was black. And so therefore she was not welcome. Well, it's pretty hard to see that as a particularly racist slur when there are job advertisements all over the place that are saying they want to hire a black scholar because he or she is black. How is it racist then to say that somebody was hired because he was black? Now, in fact,
not
she had
say
not...
he or she. It could be he or she or they. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
And so, yes, how that was racist exactly, nobody could really say, but it was certainly denounced as such. And she was disgraced. I'm sure any hopes she ever had of being hired anywhere were ended with that incident. And in fact, she had not said that. She had said to Professor...
I'll quote what she said, because you may remember it exactly, but since it's in your article, I'll quote it if you don't mind. It said, she'd actually said, "You may have got your job because you're black, but I would prefer to think you got your job because of merit."
Mm-hmm. So that was her attempt to find common ground, clearly. It wasn't meant as an insult in any way. It was meant to express some kind of affirmation of her faith in his qualifications and credentials and ability. And she hoped that they would agree that what really mattered was merit. Her only error really was in thinking that anybody cared about merit at all. And the real kicker in the whole thing was not only that she was disgraced for something, an allegedly racist utterance that she hadn't actually made, but that he had just given a presentation in which he said that journals should publish articles based solely, it seems, on the race of the academic, the race of the author. And he had said explicitly that white men would have to surrender their presence, I forget exactly the words, presence in the pages of the journals on the basis of race. And, that would be a just future. And it was just amazing to me to watch that, to see him saying that, and to watch a huge sea of mostly white, it must be admitted, attendees at his presentation applauding his statement that white scholars would be excluded from journals solely on the basis of race.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. You might wonder, why would she make such a statement?
Yeah.
You may have been hired because you're black, but I like things on merit. That's a very aggressive statement. Why would you make it to someone who's there? But the point is, she was responding to a presentation, which was itself indeed quite racist. In fact, as he put it, as you write, white men must surrender the privilege of seeing their words published and disseminated. People of color like himself will, quote, take the place of white men whose words could have or had already appeared in the classical studies journals. I mean, so who is racist? Who should be canceled? Between those sets of statements, that people of color should take the place of white men.
Yeah.
Or someone who, her statement was, provocative.
Yes.
But his was, so it's fascinating that the person who was canceled for that was her. But moreover, as you point out, if you're talking about power and privilege, who had the position of power and privilege in that debate? A woman who was an independent with no faculty position, or someone who's a tenured professor at Princeton? Mm-hmm. Who should be more sensitive and feel slighted and hard done by, or who should be more willing to say, "Oh, just forget it," Yeah. And it's kind of interesting that no one seemed to question. So, all of the sensitivity was in this poor person who supposedly had been slighted by, again, a misquoted statement. And it's kind of the sense of how, even if you have this position already of, I don't know, people somehow think that a tenured professor has huge power and privilege. Having been a tenured professor, it's not so clear, but it's certainly at least better than not having a job at all.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that someone in such a position could be so sensitive to not present an intellectual response to an argument they felt was ridiculous, but
Yeah.
instead would label it as, oh, you're obviously racist, you're obviously this. It generates that kind of sensitivity where someone who's a tenured professor at Princeton feels the need to argue that they've been harassed or
I know.
discriminated against.
Yes.
Let
It's
me, and I
I
think,
mean, you'd think he could have just said, never mind, it doesn't matter.
yeah, I
And
mean,
then, and
exactly.
given a response, of whatever his response would have been. I mean, I've heard him in interview actually say that he does believe that his blackness is an essential part of who he is as a scholar. So I would have
And
thought he would have made that argument then to her and said, no, actually, I was hired because I'm black, and that's very important for these reasons, if that's what he
exactly,
believes.
but the intellectual response rather than the emotional response.
Yeah.
But because it's become such an issue, because these requirements, people naturally can feel slighted or feel on the other side that they've been slighted because of discriminatory practices.
Yeah.
That's the problem with discrimination at one level or another, and that's what
Mhm.
this is. And one needs to talk about it rationally, as we're trying to do now, and as we do in the book, I think, for these kind of things to improve. And you say, if there's any satisfaction to be taken in sorry affairs such as this one, and in the current state of equity hiring, it's perhaps in an ironic prediction. More equity hiring will not bring us to the promised land. And that's the point. It hasn't done it after 40 years.
Nope.
And in fact, even in STEM, that's the most ridiculous thing. Even after these over efforts, it hasn't really changed the demographics, suggesting that perhaps may not be the fundamental cause of the
Mhm.
problem, if there is a problem at all. And
Yes.
I want to end with your last paragraph, because it's beautifully written, and I want to read it for you. Show trials will proliferate. The whole lot of politically correct scholars may find themselves forced out for various inadequacies and failures, for neglecting to thoroughly enough purge their discipline of whiteness, or perhaps even for sneaking in merit through the back door. Only one thing is for sure: academia as we knew it, that bastion of nerdy specialization and beautiful esoteric knowledge and curiosity-driven research, is dead, and the trendy new socially relevant so-called scholarship that killed it is a sickly thing, likely to be picked off by new waves of righteous warriors. Whether anything can be saved is a question best left to more penetrating minds than mine. Well, I'm not sure I agree with the last part, but and maybe it isn't dead. It's
I
a
hope
strong
not.
statement, but I think the point is that we've been driven to write this book because we're concerned, and the way to try and, as academics, and the academics who wrote in this book feel that the way to try and resolve these things is to openly discuss them with reason and rationality, and be willing to be questioned and debated. And I'm hoping that the book and the articles such as yours will provoke people to openly question and debate, and the Academy has to allow that. And I think hopefully with the brave example of people like yourself, willing to speak about these things and be attacked for saying it if necessary, being attacked intellectually for saying it, will encourage the rest of the community to respond appropriately, because only that internal change is going to improve the situation. External imposition is not going to improve anything. So
No,
I thank you,
unfortunately.
as always, for
Yes.
writing, and of course I thank you for speaking to me, as I told you before, and I will unabashedly say, for me, it is always such a great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Lawrence. Wonderful to speak to you. And fingers crossed it isn't dead, or at least, I mean, I really do think in the humanities it's dead. I hope it's not in the sciences. But maybe even if it is dead in some fields, it can be revived.
Well, we can always hope for
Resurrected.
miracles, and some people believe they've happened before. So
Yes.
I don't, but we'll see. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at origins-project.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at originsproject.org. Thank you.